Hi, my name is Dr. Rachel Bryant-Anderson, and I teach sociology here at San Jose State University. This video is going to talk about how to read a journal article, and it's meant as a complement to the research paper genre guide. Journal articles are the types of sources that you'll primarily be relying on in writing a research paper. They also model a lot of the expectations that you'll be expected to follow within your own research papers. So, what is a journal article? I like to think of journals as kind of like magazines. The difference is that they're related to a specific discipline and field. So in the example we see here, this is a sociological journal that's focused on gender. And the articles within it are written by experts, usually people with advanced degrees in sociology, for instance, who specialize in gender, and who are publishing their latest and greatest research related to this field. These articles get peer-reviewed, meaning that other experts in the field review them and maybe offer suggestions or input regarding whether they are good enough to be published. Students often find academic journal articles overwhelming. That's partially because of their length. They do tend to be long pieces of writing, but I think that it's probably more related to not understanding that there's a very common structure that academic journal articles follow. And once you've mastered that structure, it can be much easier to figure out what's going on within those articles. So this is essentially what that structure involves. An article will almost always start with an abstract, move to an introduction, followed by a literature review, method, findings and results, discussion and conclusion, and references. So we would see a section or multiple sections devoted to each of these things within a paper. Let's see what that looks like in an actual example. Before we jump into the abstract, we can actually look at some preliminary information that gives us some important context for the paper. That involves the title, of course. That's probably why you selected, or why a reader selected, a particular source. Tells us the authors. And if we go down to the bottom of the first page, it gives us all of the publication information we need as well. So it tells us this came from Gender and Society, that journal we saw on an earlier slide. The volume number, the date, the pages, and so forth. So, everything we would need for our reference list, for instance, would be included there. And then the keywords can be helpful in helping us advance our own source search. If we're continuing to search for sources, we might see a keyword that's relevant to what we want to talk about. So all of this is important to take note of as you're initially exploring a paper. But the paper itself actually starts with the abstract. The abstract isn't labeled here, but it's the first thing we find in the paper, and it's sort of set apart as its own paragraph with the italics. The abstract is going to provide a preview or overview. So a reader is going to look at the abstract first to determine whether this article is actually worth reading. As I noted, these are long articles, and we don't want to invest all of our time in them unless we feel like it's going to be worth it. So a reader will check out the abstract, see if it's what they were expecting from the title or whether it's relevant enough to what their own purposes are for reading the paper, and then kind of decide from there whether they want to continue on with the paper. Now, one thing to note is that an experienced reader, if they do decide to move on from the abstract, won't necessarily move on in a linear fashion. So they might still be kind of on the fence about whether they want to read the whole paper, and it would not be uncommon for that reader to skip to the end to look at either the conclusion section or findings and discussion to get sort of the takeaway of the paper to see if that's something that's worth, again, investing their time in with carefully reading through the rest of the paper as well. But we will move linearly through the paper, and the next section we'll find will be the introduction. The introduction does not start with a section title that says introduction. It just the paper just jumps into the introduction after the abstract. However, the reader knows that it's the introduction because of where it's placed and also because of what it does. So the reader is going to expect this section to introduce the topic. Hopefully, it will also get them interested. So as a reader, I would want to know, why is this topic important? Why should I care about this? What's the point of this study? The other really important thing that the introduction does in an empirical paper, meaning that the author conducted their own study and they're reporting on that study, is that they're going to tell you their research question and method, so essentially giving a preview of what their study involved. After the introduction, we pretty much always find the literature review. This is probably the biggest source of confusion within papers for students. One very important thing to understand about the literature review is that it is not about the author's own research. This is where the author is going to write about research that has been previously done, usually by other people, that relates to their own research question. So in this article, the literature review starts with this section on heteronormativity, and that's because this is a concept that's sort of central to what these authors are doing and exploring in their own research. And so they're going to tell us all about what other people have written about heteronormativity and what existing published research shows about it. The literature review is going to provide the context for the study that this author or authors wrote the paper about. They're going to tell us, what do people in this field already know about this specific topic? And then importantly, they're also going to tell us what isn't known, what hasn't been discovered from the existing research in this area. And that's called the gap in the literature. This is especially relevant for empirical research papers because it provides the justification for why the current study needs to be done, or why it will be useful, what it will add to our knowledge about this topic. The literature review is often broken into subsections or multiple sections, and that's what we see in this example. So the first literature review section covers heteronormativity, and then if we scroll down, we'll see a second one on children, media, and movies. Another important thing to note about the literature review is that it's driven by theme or topic, not by source. And we see that in the way that it's broken into sections that are labeled by theme. But we also see that within the sections. So notice that the authors are not organizing their literature review by saying, here's what our first source said, here's what our second source said. Instead, they're giving us points that they want to make about these topics, and then showing how the evidence from these various sources back up those points. So a reader is going to expect that the author will have done the work of putting these sources into a cohesive narrative that they can follow easily, rather than having a series of source summaries that they need to figure out how to connect, both in relation to each other and in relation to the author's study. In the type of research paper that the genre guide is covering, the literature review is essentially what the paper is. So this is sort of the starting and ending point for the main body of your paper, if we're not including the intro and conclusion. So this is a really important section to pay attention to in thinking about how to write your own paper. But for an empirical paper, the literature review would really just be setting up the main point of the paper, which is to talk about the author's own study. So a reader will expect to see much more detail about that study in the method section. This is where the author tells you how they conducted their own research, the method that they used, details about their sample, for instance, who or what they included in the study, how many of those people or things they included. And in this example, they've broken it into two sections. So one briefly introduces their own research, and then they get into the more specific details in the sample and method section. Beyond describing the method, the author will often also say something about the relative strengths and weaknesses of the study. After we read about how an author conducted their research, we expect to find out what they learned from that research. This comes in the findings or results section. In this example, they call the section results and discussion, and then they break it into 2 subsections, and each of those discusses a major theme from their findings. So readers will look to this section to find out, what were the results of the research of the particular study that was conducted? What kind of answer can the authors provide to their research question based on what they found out? Readers will expect to see this expressed in terms of what the findings can suggest about the question or topic, what kinds of conclusions the findings might support. We do not expect, however, to see any statements about what is proven. We will not be able to meet that standard, the standard of proof within pretty much any research that we see published within the journal articles. Next, we would expect to find the conclusion. In this example, it is very clearly and directly labeled as such, which is very helpful for the reader. And the reader's going to look to this section to find the implications of the study. So basically, what are the main takeaways that the authors want to leave the reader with? The authors will be talking about how these findings fit into the bigger picture, maybe in terms of connecting back to what they discussed in the literature review, or maybe also in terms of discussing the practical implications of their results. And then we also expect to find suggestions for future research. So the things that we can't find out from this study, but that are worth studying in future research efforts. And this is especially important because a lot of the people reading these articles are doing their own work in this area. So they might be looking to that for ideas about how they might be able to pick up the remaining gaps in what we understand about this topic in their own studies. So this section is meant to kind of wrap up the paper for the most part, although it is not the end of the paper, and the next section is actually still very important. That section would be the references. And again, the reason that this section is often important to readers is that they're typically doing their own work in this area, and that is true for you. If you're writing a research paper, you're probably still looking for sources. And so skimming through this list to see if there are sources that are relevant to your own project can be really helpful. What you want to make sure you do if you find a source, either on the reference list or cited within the paper, that says something that you really want to make sure that you include in your own paper, go ahead and find that source. So if Thomas Arnold 2005 made a point that you want to make sure you include, instead of citing this article, which is by Martin and Kazdiak, go find the article by Thomas Arnold and cite that article directly, read it and cite it directly. So that does wrap up the sections we're going to cover from the journal article and how we might expect folks to be reading those types of papers. But you can find out more about the research paper genre in the research paper genre guide, as well as the other video that's posted that walks through a student paper.